Hey there, Seb the Realtor here. In this video, I'm going to explore what it's like to work with me as your buyer's agent. If you're thinking about working with me to help you find a home, then you definitely want to watch this video. Well, I've been selling real estate here in the area for over 21 years now, going on 22 years, and for almost that whole entire time until just around August of 2024, working with buyers was really pretty simple. You would just meet a buyer somewhere, maybe at an open house, or they were referred to you, or it was like a website lead, or who knows how, but you just sort of came into orbit with the buyer. And then you would just sort of like start taking the buyer out to like look at homes. And then if the buyer found a home they liked, you would just help that buyer write a contract and, hopefully get that offer accepted. And, once it was accepted, you would, shepherd the deal along until closing. And at the end, you would get paid, that is the buyer's agent, that is I, would get paid by the seller. The seller would pay me sort of automatically. And that was all done through the system of the multiple listing service. It used to be that the multiple listing service would basically guarantee a buyer's agent a certain amount of compensation, and it was always variable. It tended to be within a certain range, shall we say, but whatever was there in the multiple listing service, that was what I got paid if I brought an offer to the seller and it was accepted and the deal closed. And so because we had that sort of a blanket offer of compensation, we didn't really need to have much in the way of formal agreements between a buyer and the buyer's agent. Now, a lot of buyer's agents were always worried, like, oh my goodness, my buyer could just like leave me at any minute because I don't have any kind of like contract with a buyer. They can just go off, they can meet some other agent at some open house somewhere else and, buy a house with that agent. And if I've been working for weeks or months with that buyer, I'm like out of luck. And that was always a risk, although it never really happened to me. So I never really spent that much time worrying about it. But some people did worry about it, and that's why they created a buyer-broker agreement, which is a contract between a buyer and a buyer's agent that says, what the buyer's agent is going to get paid if the buyer's agent helps the buyer buy a property in a certain geographic area, by a certain date, something like that. So I never ever had one of those signed by anyone. I think that most buyers I worked with kind of really enjoyed working with me. They saw a lot of value and saw no reason to jump ship. So I don't really have, or didn't really have much experience signing those formal agreements. It was always kind of loosey-goosey, and it always just worked out for like over 20 years. It was all fine. But then we had that commission lawsuit, right, where some seller in Missouri was very upset because he was basically compelled to make a blanket offer of compensation to a buyer's agent when he sold his house. And so there was a big lawsuit, the Sitzer-Burnett lawsuit, and there were a few like add-on lawsuits along the way. A bunch of other people jumped on the bandwagon. And basically, the jury ruled that the National Association of Realtors, who basically sort of formed the multiple listing service system. Most multiple listing services were owned not by the National Association of Realtors, but by like state and local associations of realtors, who we all followed their lead or their rules. All of those multiple listing services could no longer offer compensation to buyer's agents through the multiple listing service, right? So now no seller anywhere is compelled to offer a buyer's agent any compensation. And so for a time there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth. And when I say a time, actually, it was like maybe 2 months before, maybe like a month after this great change came around. Everyone was worried, what's this going to mean in terms of actual practice? But there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth going like, well, that's it. Buyer's agents are going to be basically out of the picture. Buyers are going to go directly to the listing agent, which they always could have in the past. But in point of fact, now that we are like, a couple of months now into this new system, it all kind of has, settled itself out, and it's a lot like it used to be back in the olden days. We are still seeing, the olden days 2 months ago, we are still seeing that sellers are, in almost all cases, paying a buyer's agent's commission. Now, back in the olden days, before we had this change, sellers didn't always offer basically, any kind of compensation to a buyer's agent. You had to offer $1 before, that was it. So sometimes you would see listings where they were offering $1 or they were offering $1,000 or something much less than what a buyer's agent would typically have been paid. So now, under this new regimen, basically, most sellers are not really offering anything, and it doesn't matter how much a seller may be offering to a buyer's agent, because a buyer and their agent must have a signed agreement, this buyer-broker agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent, specifying how much that buyer's agent will be paid by the buyer, not by the seller, but by the buyer. And that could be a specific dollar amount or a percentage of the purchase price, or it could be some pay schedule, right, with different percentages based on the sale price or who knows what, but it has to be spelled out in that buyer-broker agreement, and it has to say what is the area, right, like zip code, maybe, or county, or the entire state of California, and it also has to have like a duration, right, and right now those agreements cannot exceed 90 days, and you can extend them if you need to, but you can't have it set for longer than 90 days, which is funny because like almost every buyer I've worked with has taken longer than 90 days to buy a house, because it's a very competitive market. It's very challenging to get an offer accepted, to find a house that you want, all that stuff, which is why I think we don't really see a lot of buyers going directly to the listing agent, because it is so competitive. It is actually hard to like find a good property, identify a good property, weed out the good properties from the bad properties, figuring out if it really does make sense to pay $1.5 million or $900,000 or $2.5 million or whatever for a property. Buyers still see the same value in agents that they always saw before, but now you have to have this buyer representation agreement signed in order to work with that buyer. But when do you need to have that agreement signed? That is the question. Well, you definitely need to have that agreement signed before you submit an offer on a house, right? So if you are going to be using an agent to submit an offer, and that agent is your representative, you must have a buyer-broker agreement signed that says how much the agent will be paid. Now, you remember a few minutes ago I said how much the buyer is going to pay the buyer's agent. Well, actually, on that form, there is another little checkbox that basically says like buyer has no money to pay buyer's agent, and buyer wants the agent to request that the seller pay the buyer's agent. And that is in fact what we're seeing virtually all the time in actual practice, now that it's been a couple of months of this. So when you submit an offer, basically you specify in the offer that the seller is to pay the buyer's obligation to pay the buyer's agent, however much is specified in the agreement. So if the agreement says that the buyer will pay the buyer's agent 2%, you can transfer that responsibility to the seller and make the seller pay it just like the seller always used to pay it before this whole system got changed around. Or it could be 3%, or it could be $5,000, or it could be $50,000, or whatever. It is a separate agreement that is worked out between the buyer and the buyer's agent. But again, when you make your offer, you just basically say how much you want the seller to pay, right? And that's all written out there, so it's much more transparent, right? It used to be not that transparent, right? Like buyers didn't necessarily know or even care necessarily how much their agent was going to get paid, because the seller always paid that. That's why there was some issue where agents would say to buyers, my services are free, right? And that's one of the things in this lawsuit, that agents can no longer say my services are free, because that was a misrepresentation, because in fact they were being paid. They would be paying by the seller, but the seller got the money to pay them from the buyer because it was all rolled into the buyer's offer. I mean, it's which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Depends on how you want to look at it. Which side of the ledger is the buyer's agent cost on? Is it on the buyer side, the seller side, right? Anyway, so you will need to sign that buyer representation agreement before you put an offer if you are having an agent represent you, on the purchase of that property. So that buyer representation agreement, like I say, it goes up to 90 days, and you can specify like a county or the state or zip codes, single family property, condo, multifamily, right? You can, specify what kind of property that the agent will be helping you to buy as your representative. But a lot of folks, when you just meet an agent, they're going to say, you know what? I just met you and I just want to go see this house, and I don't want to have to commit to 90 days of working with you and you alone. Although I should mention that the buyer representation agreement, it could be exclusive or non-exclusive, right? So if it's non-exclusive, it means that you can work with other agents as well as working with whoever you sign that agreement with. So that's very important to know, exclusive or non-exclusive. And if I sign a buyer broker agreement with you, I'm going to sign it to be non-exclusive, right? I mean, because that's what I've been doing my whole entire career, so I don't have a problem with a non-exclusive buyer agreement. But let's just say, though, that you don't want to sign any kind of buyer representation agreement. No problem. They have another form called the PSRA, Property Showing and Representation Agreement. Basically, what that says is that it gives a specific set of properties. We're going to go and see 3 properties today, and so here are the 3 properties we're going to go and see. And this agreement lasts for these 3 properties for 30 days. And if it turns out that you make an offer on one of these properties, you agree that I should be paid X number of dollars or X percent. So if you just start working with me and we're going to go see a house or two, I will just say, listen, let's not just rush into signing this buyer representation agreement. We'll just sign this lightweight, lightweight, it's only a couple of pages, PSRA, Property Showing and Representation Agreement, just for these 2 or 3 or 4 properties or whatever. This is my fee. And then if we go into contract, if we write an offer on a contract, at that point, we would need to write a buyer representation agreement, right? So that the PSRA is only for showings, right? It's not for the actual offer itself. So if we saw some properties, you wanted to write it up, then we would need to sign a buyer representation agreement, and we would specify the commission that would match the same commission that we had on the PSRA. And then we would write in the offer that the seller is to pay that commission. Now, what happens if the seller doesn't pay that commission? Well, if the seller doesn't pay that commission, then basically you can fire me and go get some. I think how I'm comfortable working with my buyers, right? If I can't get the seller to pay, then deal's off, I guess. And that's kind of how it's always been. If the seller wasn't going to pay me a commission and the buyer wouldn't pay me a commission, I'm out, right? Because I can't work for free. My errors and omissions insurance will not cover a transaction where I'm working for free. Also, Compass, my brokerage, would not allow me to work for free because there's obviously a whole heck of a lot of liability to be representing a buyer in the purchase of a house. So if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But I've not been seeing that happening because basically sellers, they're not necessarily really against paying a buyer's commission. In fact, I've never really had a seller be against paying a buyer's commission. What the seller always cares about is how much money do they net at closing, right? What is the size of the check, right? That's always been the question, right? Are they happy with how much they get at closing, or are they unhappy? And if they're unhappy, what they're going to do is they're going to ask you for more money. They're going to say, you know what? Okay, well, instead of paying me $1 million, I'm asking for 1.1 million. You're offering $1,050,000, and you want me to pay the buyer's agent, right? Well, okay, the $1,050,000 is okay, but because you want me to pay the buyer's agent, I'm just going to counter offer you at $1,075,000 because all the seller has ever cared about is how much they get at the end of the transaction. So that's a very sort of a long way of explaining that there's basically 2 forms that have now been created to deal with the fact that buyers now need to have a signed agreement with an agent if they are going to have an agent represent them. There is the short and easy property showing and representation agreement, which we will probably sign, early on in our working relationship, just to see that first couple of properties, a few properties. If it feels like it's working out and we're going to be seeing a lot more properties over an extended period of time, I would ask you to sign a non-exclusive buyer representation agreement, which does spell out my fee. And then if we do make an offer, which I hope that we do, we would specify that the seller is to pay that obligation of the buyer for my compensation. And I expect that, in fact, the seller will be paying that. And that's what I've been seeing in practice in all cases since we actually shifted over to this new system. All right, was that plenty confusing enough? It probably was, and I hope that maybe you did understand like a little bit of that. I know it's a lot of acronyms and a bit of a word soup, and it is kind of complicated. So listen, I think maybe the best thing to do would be just to sit down and like have like a conversation. So my phone number is here at the bottom of the screen. Go ahead, give me a call, shoot me a text message, and we can just, talk it out, and I will explain it all to you and answer your questions, because probably you do have some questions as well. All right, well, that is all I have for this video. I hope that it was not too confusing and somewhat worthwhile. And if you did find it valuable, I'm guessing, totally just a guess, that you might also enjoy some of these videos over here. These are some of the most popular videos here on my YouTube channel, so please do take a look. All right, that's all I have for this video. Thank you so very much for watching, and please stay tuned.